In the 1960s, the United States was rocked by protests demanding the end of racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement of African Americans. But the roots of the struggle for civil rights go back much, much further. Indeed, the question of slavery was one of the fundamental political questions that divided the United States early in its history. The Constitutional Convention was forced to address the question, and several key features of the Constitution were the result of a desire to maintain a delicate political balance between the northern and southern states. The 3/5 Compromise gave slave-owning states disproportionate political power, augmenting their influence in the U.S. House and in the Electoral College. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution required free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, and the Constitution itself prohibited Congress from addressing the slave trade before 1808. Prior to the Civil War, approximately 4 million black people, representing more than 12% of the total U.S. population, were enslaved in the United States, primarily in the South. Generally, only propertied white men could vote, and the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited U.S. citizenship to whites. 8 presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, John Tyler, James Polk, and Zachary Taylor, owned slaves while in the White House, and 4 others, Martin Van Buren, William Harrison, Andrew Johnson, and Ulysses Grant, owned slaves during their lives, but not while they were serving as president. All of this highlights the contradiction between the sentiments of political liberty expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and the existence of slavery in the United States, and this is a fundamental paradox in American history. The Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, famously states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words set out a vision of human rights and individual liberty, but despite the proclaimed ideals, slavery was deeply entrenched as an institution in the United States at the time. Many of the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson himself, were slave owners. Slavery was legal and widely practiced, particularly in the southern states. But even before the Civil War, there was a significant social and political campaign aimed at ending the practice of slavery. The movement, which dated back to the colonial era, gained momentum in the early 19th century and continued until the Civil War. And while most of the political elite of the day were comfortable with the institution of slavery in the United States, several were more critical. Recognizing the tensions between promoting liberty and maintaining slavery, Benjamin Franklin freed the slaves he owned in the early 1780s, becoming an outspoken critic of the institution. He ultimately became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and petitioned the U.S. Congress to abolish slavery and provide support for freed slaves. John Adams, the second president of the United States, did not own slaves, as both he and his wife and most trusted political advisor, Abigail Adams, were vocal opponents of slavery, arguing the institution was a violation of the principles of the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton was critical of slavery and was a founding member of the New York Manumission Society, an organization dedicated to advocating for emancipation and providing educational opportunities to freed slaves and their children. Thomas Paine, best known for his influential pamphlet Common Sense, was also an abolitionist who condemned slavery in his writings, calling it a violation of human rights. And John Jay, who would become the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was president of the New York Manumission Society and worked towards emancipation in New York. Individuals opposed to slavery as part of the abolition movement frequently drew on Enlightenment ideals of human rights and certain threads of evangelical Christianity, which emphasized moral rectitude and social justice. The previously mentioned Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, championed by Benjamin Franklin, and the New York Manumission Society, which included both Alexander Hamilton and John Jay as members, are examples of the former. The Religious Society of Friends, commonly known as the Quakers, are an example of the latter. The Quakers were amongst the earliest organized abolitionists, viewing slavery as a profoundly moral wrong based on their religious beliefs in equity and pacifism, beliefs which played a significant role in shaping the early abolitionist movement's rhetoric and tactics. Indeed, as early as 1688, Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, drafted and adopted the Germantown Quaker Petition Against Slavery, one of the first formal anti-slavery documents in the colonies. African American abolitionists played a critical role in the movement as well, with figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman serving not only as vocal advocates against slavery, but also symbolizing the struggle for freedom. Douglass in particular became a national leader of the abolitionist movement, using his writing and oratory skills to challenge the justifications of slavery. His What to the Slave is the 4th of July speech represents one of the most powerful texts highlighting the hypocrisy of the country's celebration of freedom and independence in the context of the ongoing enslavement of its people. The abolition movement also had a more subversive side, operating most notably through the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses that helped African Americans find freedom in northern states or in Canada. Those who helped escape slaves along the way, often called conductors, provided food and shelter in safe houses, often referred to as stations, as well as guidance to other assistants. Harriet Tubman, herself a former slave, was one of the most well-known conductors on the Underground Railroad. While the abolition movement helped bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of the national consciousness and polarized opinions in the lead-up to the Civil War, many states, particularly in the North, abolished slavery well before then. Indeed, thanks in part to the efforts of Benjamin Franklin and others, Pennsylvania was the first state to begin the gradual process of emancipation when, in 1780, it passed a law that prohibited the importation of new slaves, required the registration of children born to enslaved parents, and provided that any such children would automatically be freed on their 28th birthday. While not ending slavery outright, the law effectively started the clock on the elimination of slavery as an institution by 1808. Slavery in Massachusetts was effectively ended through a state Supreme Court decision that ruled the institution unconstitutional in 1783, making it the first state in the Union to end slavery outright. A number of northern states implemented laws for the gradual elimination of slavery based on the Pennsylvania model in the 1780s, including New Hampshire in 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, Vermont in 1786, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. And over the next 50 years or so, as a result of a variety of political concessions, including the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, the balance of free and slave states emerged such that at the dawn of the Civil War in 1861, there were 18 free states and 15 slave states. These tensions came to a head during the U.S. Civil War, after which 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, fundamentally transformed the American political landscape. Adopted in 1865, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment extended U.S. citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, thereby extending citizenship to African Americans who, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision in 1857, could not be U.S. citizens. It also extended the Constitution's provisions for due process and equal protection clauses to the states and overturned the Three-Fifths Compromise. And the 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, extended the franchise, providing that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Civil War amendments were part of a broader policy of Reconstruction when the United States undertook the process of reintegrating the Confederacy back into the Union and rebuilding the South. The era was marked by significant political, social, and economic changes, with a primary focus on addressing the status of newly freed slaves. In addition to the changes brought about by the Civil War amendments, the federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, formerly known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, to aid former slaves in their transition from slavery to freedom. It provided food, housing, medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. It also attempted to settle former slaves on land confiscated or abandoned during the war. Black political participation skyrocketed under Reconstruction. To take but one example during this time, 14 African American men were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, including Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, the first black member of the House of Representatives. In addition, 2 black men were elected to the Senate, including Hiram Revels of Mississippi, who became the first black U.S. senator. But many in the South actively resisted Reconstruction-era reforms. Black codes were developed by state governments in an effort to limit the freedom of newly freed slaves and ensure black citizens remained available for plantation labor following the abolition of slavery. Black codes used a variety of provisions to achieve this goal, including forcing African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts or be arrested, fined, or imprisoned, and being forced into unpaid labor. Local authorities used vagrancy laws to force freed persons into forced labor, and state and local governments passed other legislation to limit the rights of African Americans to own property, conduct business, bear arms, and even move through public spaces. While many of these provisions were made illegal under the 14th Amendment, Jim Crow laws emerged to replace them. Named for a derogatory caricature of African Americans popular in the 1830s, Jim Crow laws institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination, mandating racial segregation in most areas of public life and public facilities, imposing restrictions on voter registration, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, and prohibiting interracial marriage or sexual relationships. Violence and intimidation was widely employed to suppress resistance. Such violence operated both through the formal channels of the state, particularly through local police and court systems, and through non-state actors like the Ku Klux Klan, which rose to prominence at this time. Not surprisingly, the Southern states worked actively to bring Reconstruction to an end. Political standoffs between President Andrew Jackson, who favored a more lenient approach to the South, and the radical Republicans in Congress who advocated for stronger measures to ensure civil rights for freed slaves, were ultimately resolved by the corrupt bargain of 1877, which led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and with it the end of the Reconstruction era. Seeking to escape Jim Crow, racial violence, and limited economic opportunities, many black Southerners moved north in search of new opportunities. Indeed, beginning around 1916, about 6 million African Americans moved from rural southern states to urban northeastern, midwestern, and western cities, a period known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration had profound impacts on American society and culture. It dramatically shifted the demographic makeup of American cities, leading to the growth of African American communities in places like Chicago, New York, particularly in Harlem, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and others. The migration led to a flowering of African American culture in these urban areas, most notably seen through the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural, social, and artistic movement that fostered a new black cultural identity centered in Harlem, New York. Writers and artists like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, and many others used their art to express black cultural identity and pride through literature, art, music, theater, and so on. This expression was a form of empowerment, challenging prevailing racial stereotypes and showcasing the richness and diversity of African American experiences. The art and literature of the Harlem Renaissance often contained themes of resistance against racial oppression and injustice, as artists used their work to critique racial discrimination and celebrate black identity, laying the groundwork for cultural aspects of the civil rights movement. The popularity of Harlem Renaissance culture, particularly jazz and blues music, among both black and white audiences, also helped break down some racial barriers, fostering a greater appreciation and respect for African American cultural contributions in broader American society. And the Harlem Renaissance provided a foundation for the civil rights movement, fostering a new generation of African American intellectuals and activists. Figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who was already an established civil rights leader, used the energy of the Harlem Renaissance to promote ideas about racial equality and civil rights. At the same time, the influx of African Americans into northern and western cities sometimes led to racial tensions, including race riots like those in Chicago in 1919 and Tulsa in 1921, and the establishment of racially segregated neighborhoods. Founded in 1905 by W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, the Niagara Movement was a significant early step in the African American struggle for civil rights and laid an important groundwork for subsequent civil rights activism, including the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The movement was founded in response to the increasing violence against African Americans and the lack of progress in civil rights in the country. The Niagara Movement advocated for full civil liberties and end to racial discrimination and recognition of human brotherhood. It called for equal economic and educational opportunities, condemned racial segregation, and demanded full voting rights for African American men. Although the Niagara Movement was relatively short-lived and faced internal divisions and external opposition, ultimately leading to its collapse in 1910, it set the stage for the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. Many of its members, including Du Bois, became leaders in the NAACP, which became the nation's preeminent civil rights organization. The principles and tactics employed by the Niagara movement, such as direct action, public protests, and demand for full and immediate equality, also influenced future civil rights activism, shifting the discourse on African American rights from accommodation to equality. In doing so, the ideas and activism of the Niagara movement inspired future generations of civil rights leaders, and its emphasis on dignity, equality, and justice resonated through the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, as seen in speeches from leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and others. But that's it for now. We'll continue to look at the struggle for civil rights in our next video. Please check that out, and see you next time. Bye.